The gunshot echoed through the valley just as Grace Nolan's boots slipped on the icy rock, and she knew in that instant that everything she had worked for during the past 3 months was about to fall apart. December 1883 had brought an early winter to Buffalo, Wyoming, and the storm that had been threatening all morning finally began to unleash its fury as fat snowflakes started drifting down from the pewter sky. Grace pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her breath coming in ragged gasps, clutching the leather satchel that contained enough evidence to hang 3 men, and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She had been running for 2 days straight, ever since she discovered the truth about the land office fraud that had stolen her family's ranch right out from under them. Her father had died believing he had failed, not knowing that crooked officials had forged documents and bribed judges to transfer the deed to a cattle baron from Cheyenne. Grace had spent months working as a clerk in that same land office, copying files late at night, gathering proof, building a case that would stand up in a territorial court. But someone had noticed her poking around, and now she was running for her life through the Bighorn Mountains with killers on her trail. The snow fell harder now, thick flakes that stuck to her eyelashes and melted against her flushed cheeks. Grace stumbled forward, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, and the cold was seeping through her wool coat, making her fingers numb and clumsy. The trail ahead disappeared into a white curtain, and she could barely see 10 feet in front of her face. Behind her, she heard voices shouting, harsh and angry, growing closer. She needed to find shelter, needed to hide, needed to rest. But the only thing ahead was wilderness, miles and miles of it, and the only thing behind was certain death. Grace pushed forward, her boots crunching through the deepening snow, her lungs burning with each frozen breath. The path grew steeper, and she had to use her hands to pull herself up over rocks that cut through her thin gloves. Blood spotted the snow where her palms scraped against stone, but she did not dare stop. The voices faded somewhat, muffled by the storm, and Grace allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps they had lost her trail. Perhaps the snow would cover her tracks. Perhaps she would make it to the territorial marshal's office in Sheridan after all. She crested a ridge and started down the other side, moving faster now, almost running, desperate to put distance between herself and her pursuers. That was when her foot caught on a hidden root, and she went sprawling forward, tumbling down the slope in a cascade of snow and frozen earth. The satchel flew from her grip, sailing through the air, and Grace screamed as she rolled, her body slamming against rocks and branches, until she finally came to rest at the bottom of a gully, half buried in a snowdrift. Everything hurt. Her shoulder throbbed where she had landed on it, her ankle sent shooting pains up her leg, and her head spun with dizziness. Grace tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out and she collapsed back into the snow. The world tilted and swayed, and dark spots danced across her vision. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones now, could feel her body starting to shut down, and she knew with terrible clarity that she was going to die out here in this frozen wilderness, and no one would ever know what had happened to her. Through the curtain of falling snow, she saw a shape moving toward her. At first, she thought it was one of the men chasing her, and she tried to crawl away, but her body would not obey. The shape resolved into a man on horseback, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow. He dismounted in one smooth motion and knelt beside her, his face coming into focus, and Grace found herself looking into the most striking pair of gray eyes she had ever seen. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "You are hurt bad. Do not try to move." The satchel, Grace gasped, trying to lift her head. "I need the satchel." "I will get it. First, we need to get you out of this storm." He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her, and the warmth of it was so overwhelming that Grace almost sobbed with relief. He picked her up as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest, and carried her to his horse. "Wait," Grace said, her voice weak. "The men who are following me, they will kill you too." The cowboy's jaw tightened and he glanced back up the slope. "How many?" "3. Maybe 4. They work for Edmund Sharp." Recognition flickered in his eyes at the name, and something else too, something dark and dangerous. "Edmund Sharp's men will not be following anyone in this storm, but we need to move fast. Can you hold on?" Grace nodded, though she was not sure she could. He lifted her onto the horse and swung up behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. With his free hand, he guided the horse back up the slope, and Grace watched in a daze as he leaned down and scooped up the satchel without dismounting, his movements practiced and sure. The ride that followed was a blur of pain and cold and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the solid warmth of the man behind her and the sound of his voice in her ear, low and reassuring, telling her to stay awake, to hold on just a little longer. She tried to focus on his words, tried to keep her eyes open, but the darkness kept pulling at her, dragging her down. When she finally came back to herself, she was lying on a bed in a small cabin, wrapped in thick blankets with a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Her wet clothes had been removed and replaced with a soft flannel shirt that was far too large for her, and her injured ankle had been wrapped in clean bandages. The satchel sat on a table near the bed, its contents apparently undisturbed. The cowboy stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot, his back to her. He had removed his hat, and Grace could see that his hair was dark brown, almost black, and just long enough to curl at his collar. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with the lean, muscular build of someone who made his living with his hands. Even from behind, there was something compelling about him, something that made her want to keep looking. "You are awake," he said without turning around, and Grace wondered how he had known. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell down a mountain," Grace said, and was surprised to hear him laugh, a warm sound that filled the small space. "That is because you did." He ladled something into a bowl and carried it over to her, setting it on the table beside the bed. "Venison stew. You need to eat." Grace pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing as her shoulder protested. "Who are you?" "Daniel Greene," he said, pulling a chair over and sitting down. "I have a ranch about 5 miles west of here, up in the high country. I was checking on my cattle when I saw you fall." "Grace Nolan," she said, and watched as his eyes widened slightly. "Patrick Nolan's daughter. You knew my father." Everyone in this part of Wyoming knew Patrick Nolan. He was a good man, an honest rancher. What happened to him was criminal. Daniel's expression hardened. "I heard he lost his ranch to some land deal gone wrong and died of a broken heart. That was about 6 months ago, was it not?" 7 months, Grace said quietly. "And it was not a land deal gone wrong. It was fraud. Edmund Sharp wanted our water rights, and he paid officials in the land office to forge documents transferring our deed to him. My father died not knowing that he had been cheated, thinking he had somehow failed to read the fine print or understand the law. I have been working in the land office since then, gathering evidence. That satchel contains copies of all the forged documents, records of the bribes, testimony from a clerk who was threatened into participating. It is enough to put Sharp and his cronies in prison and get our land back." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes intent on her face. "And Sharp found out what you were doing. 3 days ago. I had just finished copying the last of the documents when I heard men coming. I barely made it out the window before they broke down the door. I have been running ever since, trying to reach the territorial marshal in Sheridan. Sheridan is 40 miles from here, and this storm is going to last for days. Even if you were not injured, you would not make it in this weather. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white world beyond. Sharp's men will be holed up somewhere waiting for the storm to pass, just like we are. When it clears, they will pick up your trail again. Then I need to leave as soon as possible, Grace said, though the thought of going back out into that cold made her want to weep. You are not going anywhere on that ankle for at least a few days, and even then, you will not make it alone. Daniel turned back to her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. I will take you to Sheridan, but first, you need to heal and we need to wait out this storm. Grace studied him for a long moment, trying to read the man behind those steady gray eyes. Everything about him suggested competence and strength, from the way he moved to the way he spoke. But more than that, there was a kindness in him, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. She found herself wanting to trust him, even though she knew that trusting the wrong person could get her killed. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You do not know me. If Sharp finds out you helped me, he will come after you too." Daniel's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. Edmund Sharp has been stealing land and bullying honest ranchers for years. Someone needs to stand up to him. Besides, your father once helped me when I needed it. About 8 years ago, I was a young fool who had gambled away everything I owned in a poker game in Cheyenne. I was ready to put a bullet in my brain when Patrick Nolan found me in a saloon. He bought me dinner, let me sleep in his barn, and gave me a job working his cattle for the summer. He never asked questions, never made me feel like I was less than a man for having failed. By the end of that summer, I had saved enough to buy a few head of cattle and start my own ranch. Everything I have now, I owe to your father. So helping you is not charity, Grace Nolan. It is paying a debt. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back, not wanting to cry in front of this stranger who was quickly becoming something more. He never mentioned you. That was the kind of man he was. He did not do good deeds to be praised for them. Daniel picked up the bowl of stew and held it out to her. Now eat. You need your strength. The stew was rich and flavorful, thick with chunks of tender meat and vegetables, and Grace ate slowly, savoring each bite. She had not realized how hungry she was until the food hit her stomach. And then she was ravenous, scraping the bowl clean and accepting a second helping without embarrassment. Daniel watched her eat with what looked like satisfaction, and when she finally set the empty bowl aside, he took it back to the stove and poured her a cup of coffee. "Tell me about Edmund Sharp's operation," he said, settling back into his chair. "How many men does he have working for him?" "At least 20, maybe more. Some are legitimate ranch hands, but others are gunmen and thugs. The 3 who chased me into the mountains are the worst of them. Colter Ryan, Jack Barnes, and a man they call Snake because of a scar on his neck. They have killed before, I am sure of it, though no one can prove anything." "I know those names," Daniel said grimly. "Ryan and Barnes were involved in a range war down in Casper 2 years ago. 3 farmers ended up dead, their homesteads burned. Nothing was ever proven, but everyone knew who did it. If those are the men after you, we need to be very careful." Grace shivered despite the warmth of the blankets. "Do you think they will find us here? This cabin is well hidden and the storm will cover our tracks. But we should be prepared for anything." Daniel stood and walked to a gun rack on the wall, checking the rifles there with practiced efficiency. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me. I am not a sharpshooter, but I can hit what I aim at." "Good. I hope it will not come to that, but if it does, I want you to be able to defend yourself." He returned to his chair and fixed her with a serious look. "Get some rest now. You are safe here, I promise you that." Grace wanted to argue that she was fine, that she did not need rest, but her body had other ideas. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she found herself sinking back into the pillows, the warmth of the fire and the fullness of her stomach lulling her into a sense of security she had not felt in days. Just before she drifted off, she heard Daniel moving around the cabin, banking the fire and checking the door, and she felt a wave of gratitude so strong it made her chest ache. When she woke again, it was dark outside, and the cabin was lit only by the glow of the fire. The storm still raged beyond the walls, wind howling and snow battering the windows. Grace sat up carefully, testing her ankle and finding it less painful than before. Her shoulder was stiff but usable, and aside from various bruises and scrapes, she seemed to be recovering well. Daniel sat at the table, the satchel open in front of him, studying the documents inside by the light of an oil lamp. His face was serious, his brow furrowed with concentration, and Grace watched him for a moment before speaking, finding anything interesting. He looked up, startled, and then smiled. "You should be sleeping. I have slept enough. What do you think of the evidence?" Daniel shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "This is worse than I thought. Sharp has been doing this for years, not just to your family but to at least a dozen other ranchers. Some of these names I recognize. Good people who lost everything and had to move on, and the corruption goes deep. There are judges, land office clerks, even a territorial legislator involved." Grace swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the twinge in her ankle. "That is why I had to be so careful. If I had gone to the local authorities, they might have been on Sharp's payroll. The territorial marshal in Sheridan is supposed to be clean, one of the few honest lawmen left. That is why I have to get these documents to him." "Then that is what we will do," Daniel said firmly. "As soon as this storm passes and you can travel, we will head to Sheridan, but we need to be smart about it. Sharp's men will be watching the main roads, so we will have to take the mountain trails. It will be slower, but safer." Grace stood carefully, testing her weight on her injured ankle. It held, though it throbbed with each step. She walked over to the table and looked down at the documents spread across its surface, at the careful notes she had made in her own handwriting, documenting dates and amounts and names. Months of work, months of living in fear, all leading to this moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. I know you say you are repaying a debt to my father, but this is more than that. You are risking your life for me, for a stranger." Daniel looked up at her, and in the lamplight, his eyes seemed to hold depth she had not noticed before. "You are not a stranger anymore, Grace Nolan. And even if your father had never helped me, I would still do this. What Sharp is doing is wrong, and someone needs to stop him." There was something in the way he said her name, something that made her pulse quicken. Grace found herself very aware of how close they were standing, of the breadth of his shoulders and the strength in his hands. She was still wearing his flannel shirt, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather, and something indefinably male that made her stomach flutter. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, suddenly realizing that there was only one bed in the cabin. "I have a bedroll. I will be fine by the fire." "That is not right. This is your cabin. I should sleep by the fire." Daniel's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "You are injured and recovering. You need the bed more than I do. Besides, I have slept in far worse places than a warm cabin with a good fire." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Grace felt something shift between them, something electric and alive. Then Daniel cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. "You should eat something else before you go back to sleep. I have some bread and cheese." They sat at the table together, sharing a simple meal and talking in low voices while the storm raged outside. Daniel told her about his ranch, about the herd of cattle he had built up over the years, about the challenges of making a living in this harsh country. Grace told him about her life before her father died, about growing up on the ranch, learning to ride and rope and brand cattle alongside the ranch hands. She told him about her mother, who had died when Grace was 12, and about the years after when it had been just her and her father against the world. "I loved that ranch," she said, her voice catching. "It was my whole life. Every morning I would wake up and look out my window at the mountains, and I would think that I was the luckiest person alive. And then it was all gone, just like that. My father could not bear it. He aged 10 years in a month. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The doctor said it was his heart, but I knew the truth. He died of a broken spirit." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "We will get your ranch back, Grace. I promise you that." Grace looked down at their joined hands, at the way her small fingers disappeared into his larger ones, and felt something bloom in her chest, something warm and bright and terrifying. She had not let herself depend on anyone since her father died, had not let herself trust or hope or feel. But sitting here in this small cabin with this man who had appeared out of a snowstorm like some kind of guardian angel, she found those old defenses crumbling. "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Not just about the ranch, but about you. Where did you come from? What brought you to Wyoming?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I was born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys. My father was a farmer, a hard man who believed in hard work and harder discipline. I could never do anything right in his eyes. When I was 17, I had enough. I took what little money I had saved and headed west, thinking I would make my fortune and prove him wrong. Instead, I learned that the world does not care about your dreams or your pride. I drifted from town to town, taking whatever work I could find, losing everything I earned at the card tables. By the time I met your father, I was 21 years old and had nothing to show for my life but scars and regrets." "But you changed," Grace said. "My father helped you change. He showed me that it was possible to start over, to build something worth having. More than that, he treated me with respect when I had done nothing to earn it. That meant everything to me." Daniel's eyes met hers, and Grace saw old pain there and old shame, but also strength and determination. "I am not that foolish boy anymore, Grace. I have worked hard to become a man worthy of the second chance your father gave me, and I will not let his daughter down." The intensity of his gaze made Grace's breath catch, and she found herself leaning closer, drawn to him in a way she did not fully understand. In the flickering firelight, Daniel's face was all sharp planes and shadows, ruggedly handsome in a way that made her heart race. She wondered what it would be like to kiss him, to feel those firm lips against hers, and the thought made her cheeks flush with heat. Daniel must have seen something in her expression, because his own face changed, his eyes darkening with an emotion that matched what she was feeling. He stood abruptly, releasing her hand, and walked to the window, putting distance between them. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "We have a long few days ahead of us." Grace understood what he was doing, understood that he was trying to be honorable, to protect her reputation and his own integrity. But part of her wished he would not, wished he would come back to the table and take her hand again, and let whatever was building between them run its course. Instead, she stood and walked back to the bed, climbing under the blankets and turning her face to the wall. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly. "Good night, Grace." She lay awake for a long time, listening to him move around the cabin, listening to the storm outside, thinking about everything that had happened in the past few days. Her life had been turned upside down, and she was in more danger than she had ever been in before. But lying here in this warm cabin with Daniel Greene just a few feet away, she felt safer than she had in months. More than that, she felt something stirring inside her, something that had been dormant since her father died. She felt alive again, felt hope again, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. The storm continued for 3 more days, dumping snow until the drifts were higher than a man's head and the world outside the cabin was a white wilderness. Grace and Daniel fell into an easy routine, taking turns cooking and cleaning, playing cards in the evening, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Grace's ankle healed quickly, and soon she was able to walk without pain, though Daniel insisted she should not push it too hard. They grew comfortable with each other in a way that surprised them both. Grace learned that Daniel had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh even when she was worried about what lay ahead. She learned that he was well-read despite his rough exterior, that he loved poetry and could quote Whitman and Emerson from memory. She learned that he was a talented cook, that he sang quietly to himself when he thought she was not listening, and that he had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was deep in thought. Daniel learned that Grace was stronger than she looked, that she had a spine of steel beneath her quiet demeanor. He learned that she was whip-smart, that she could do sums in her head faster than he could with pencil and paper, and that she had a gift for reading people. He learned that she loved books as much as he did, that she had taught herself to read legal documents and understand complicated property law, and that she was passionate about justice in a way that was both admirable and a little frightening. But more than anything, they learned that they enjoyed being together, that the hours passed quickly when they were talking, that the silences between them were comfortable rather than awkward. And underneath it all, there was a tension growing, an awareness of each other that neither of them could ignore. On the 3rd night, Grace woke from a nightmare, crying out in fear. In her dream, she had been back in the land office and Sharp's men had found her and they were closing in and she could not move, could not run, could only watch as they raised their guns. She sat up gasping, her heart pounding, and found Daniel kneeling beside the bed, his hand on her shoulder. "It was just a dream," he said softly. "You are safe. I am here." Grace was shaking, the fear from the nightmare still gripping her. Without thinking, she reached for him, and Daniel gathered her into his arms, holding her close. She buried her face against his chest, breathing in his scent, feeling the solid warmth of him, and slowly the terror faded. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to wake you. Do not apologize. You have been through hell. It would be strange if you did not have nightmares." Daniel's hand smoothed over her hair, a gesture so gentle it made her want to cry for different reasons. "Do you want to talk about it?" Grace shook her head, not trusting her voice. She should pull away, should put proper distance between them, but she could not make herself move. Being in Daniel's arms felt too good, felt too right, and she was tired of being strong all the time, tired of being brave. Just for this moment, she wanted to let someone else carry the weight. Daniel seemed to understand. He did not push her away or make awkward excuses. He simply held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his arms a solid circle of protection around her. They stayed like that for a long time, and gradually Grace felt herself relaxing, felt the tension draining from her muscles. "My father used to tell me that courage is not the absence of fear," she said finally. "He said it is being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. I am trying to be brave like he was, but sometimes I am so scared I can hardly breathe." "Being scared does not make you weak, Grace. It makes you human." Daniel pulled back just enough to look down at her, and in the dim light his eyes were very serious. "But you do not have to face this alone anymore. I am with you and I will not let anything happen to you. Do you believe that?" Grace looked up at him, at the strength in his face and the determination in his eyes, and she did believe it. More than that, she realized with a jolt that went through her whole body, she was falling in love with him. It was too fast, too soon, too impossible given the circumstances, but there it was. Somewhere between the moment he had picked her up out of the snow and this moment here in the quiet darkness of the cabin, she had given him her heart. "I believe you," she whispered, and saw his expression change, saw the same realization dawn in his eyes. He raised one hand to her face, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone, and Grace held her breath, waiting, hoping. The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her throat. Daniel leaned closer, so close she could feel his breath on her lips, and for a moment she thought he was going to kiss her. But at the last second he pulled back, his jaw clenching. "Grace, I cannot. You are vulnerable right now, and I will not take advantage of that. When this is over, when you are safe and have had time to think clearly, then maybe. But not now, not like this." Grace felt a stab of disappointment so sharp, it was almost physical pain. But she also felt a swell of respect for this man who was honorable enough to deny himself what he wanted for her sake. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Daniel helped her settle back into the bed, pulling the blankets up around her shoulders. "Try to sleep," he said gently. "I will be right here if you need me." Grace closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay in the darkness, aware of Daniel stretched out in his bedroll by the fire, aware of the space between them that felt like both a comfort and a torment. She wanted him to come back, wanted to feel his arms around her again, but she also understood why he would not. He was trying to protect her, trying to do the right thing, and she loved him even more for it. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally blown out. Daniel went outside to check the conditions and came back with good news and bad news. The good news was that the main trails were passable. The bad news was that someone had been nosing around during the night. He had found tracks in the snow near the creek, too deliberate to be from an animal. "They are looking for us," Daniel said grimly. "We need to leave today while we still have a chance." Grace felt fear clench in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She had come too far to give up now. "I am ready." They spent the morning preparing for the journey, packing supplies into saddlebags, checking weapons, planning their route. Daniel had a second horse, a sturdy mare that he said was sure-footed on mountain trails, and he saddled both animals while Grace made sure the documents in the satchel were secure. She wrapped them in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, then strapped the satchel across her chest so it would not be lost. They left the cabin just after noon, riding single file through the snow-covered forest. Daniel led the way on his big gelding, breaking trail for Grace's mare to follow. The going was slow and treacherous, with snowdrifts hiding roots and rocks that could trip a horse. But both animals were experienced mountain horses, and they picked their way carefully through the obstacles. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Daniel suddenly held up his hand, signaling Grace to stop. He sat very still on his horse, his head cocked, listening. Grace strained her ears and heard it too, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. Daniel motioned for her to follow and guided his horse off the main trail, into a thick stand of pines. They dismounted and led the horses deeper into the trees, moving as quietly as possible. Daniel found a spot where they were hidden from the trail but could see through the branches, and they waited, hardly daring to breathe. 3 riders came into view, moving slowly, studying the ground. Grace recognized them immediately, her blood running cold. Colter Ryan rode in front, a big man with a red beard and cruel eyes. Jack Barnes followed, lean and dangerous looking, and bringing up the rear was Snake, the scar on his neck visible even from this distance. "Tracks head this way," Ryan was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "2 horses, recent. Could be our girl and whoever is helping her." "Could be just a trapper," Barnes said, but he did not sound convinced. "We check it out anyway. Sharp wants that woman found, and he wants those documents destroyed. He is paying us good money to make sure this problem goes away permanently." Ryan spat into the snow, a gesture of contempt. "I am tired of chasing through these mountains. When we find her, I am going to enjoy making her tell us where she hid those papers before I put a bullet in her." Grace felt Daniel tense beside her, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. She touched his arm, shaking her head, silently begging him not to give them away. 3 against 1 were bad odds, even for a man as capable as Daniel. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight with anger, but finally nodded. They waited until the 3 riders had passed out of sight, and then waited some more, making sure they were truly gone. Finally, Daniel let out a long breath and turned to Grace. "We need to change our route. If they are tracking us, we cannot go directly to Sheridan. We will head north instead, toward the old mining camps in the mountains. There are people there who owe me favors, people who will help us hide until we can figure out a safer way to reach the marshal." "How far is it?" 2 days hard riding, maybe 3 if we have to keep dodging Sharp's men, but it is our best option." Daniel helped her back onto her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "Stay close to me, Grace. If shooting starts, you ride hard and do not look back, understand? Get those documents to Sheridan no matter what happens to me." "I am not leaving you," Grace said fiercely. "We are in this together." Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him that it would be pointless. Instead, he nodded and swung up onto his own horse. "Then we had better make sure it does not come to that." They rode through the afternoon, taking a winding route through the high country that only someone who knew these mountains intimately could follow. Daniel seemed to know every trail and game path, every place where the snow would be less deep or the going easier. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat some jerky and hardtack, and then pushed on as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon. As twilight fell, they came to a small valley sheltered by high cliffs, with a frozen stream running through it. Daniel led them to a cave he knew, well hidden behind a rockfall, and they made camp for the night. It was too risky to build a fire that might give away their position, so they huddled together for warmth, wrapped in blankets and eating a cold supper. "Tell me about the mining camps," Grace said, partly to distract herself from the cold and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. "Why would people there help us? 2 winters ago, there was a bad influenza outbreak in the camps," Daniel said. "A lot of men died because there was no doctor and no medicine. I rode through a blizzard to get to Buffalo and bring back a doctor and supplies. Saved a lot of lives. The miners have long memories when it comes to debts. If I ask for help, they will give it." Grace leaned against him, sharing warmth, and felt his arm come around her shoulders. It felt natural now, comfortable, like they had been doing this for years instead of days. "You are a good man, Daniel Greene. I am just a man trying to do the right thing. That is what makes you good." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the rocks outside the cave. Grace thought about what Ryan had said on the trail, about enjoying making her suffer, and she shivered despite the blankets. Daniel felt it and pulled her closer. "I will not let them hurt you," he said quietly. "I would die before I let that happen." "Please do not die," Grace said, trying for lightness but hearing the tremor in her own voice. "I have plans for you that involve staying very much alive." "What kind of plans?" Grace hesitated, then decided that life was too short and too uncertain to hold back. "Plans that involve you and me and maybe a future together if you want that. I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other a few days, but I cannot help how I feel. You saved my life, Daniel, but more than that, you reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people worth fighting for. I do not want to lose that. I do not want to lose you." Daniel was very still, and for a terrible moment, Grace thought she had made a mistake, had revealed too much too soon. Then he turned to face her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "Grace Nolan, from the moment I picked you up out of that snow, something in me recognized something in you. I do not know if it was fate or chance or divine providence, but I do know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are brave and strong and smart and beautiful, and every moment I spend with you makes me want 1,000 more. So yes, I want those plans. I want that future. I want everything with you." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, he did not pull back. His lips met hers softly at first, tentatively, and then with growing confidence as Grace responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and desperate, months and years of loneliness pouring out of both of them. Grace had been kissed before, clumsy kisses from ranch hands and awkward suitors, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way Daniel kissed her like she was precious and necessary, like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace. I know I should not say it so soon, but I do. I love you." "I love you too," Grace whispered, and felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. "I love you so much it scares me." They held each other through the long, cold night, sometimes talking in whispers, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. They talked about the future they wanted to build together, about the ranch they would have, about the children they might raise. They talked about small things and important things and everything in between, learning each other in the way that new lovers do, hungry for every detail. As dawn broke, they reluctantly separated and prepared to ride again. Grace's body was stiff and sore from sleeping on the cave floor, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them with Daniel at her side, and that made all the difference. They made good time through the morning, the trail climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner and colder, and their breath came out in white puffs. Around mid-morning they crested a ridge and Daniel pointed to a cluster of rough buildings in the valley below. "Silver Creek Camp," he said. "We will be safe there." But as they started down the slope, a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up snow inches from Grace's horse. The mare spooked, rearing, and Grace fought to keep her seat. Daniel wheeled his gelding around, his rifle already in his hands, and Grace saw the 3 riders coming hard from the south, guns drawn. "Ride!" Daniel shouted and slapped the mare's rump, sending her plunging down the slope. Grace gave the horse her head, letting the animal pick the fastest route down the treacherous trail, while behind her, she heard more gunfire. She wanted to look back, wanted to make sure Daniel was following, but she did not dare take her attention off the trail. The mare was running full out now, her hooves throwing up snow, and Grace clung to the saddle horn, praying they would not fall. They burst into the mining camp at a full gallop, and Grace hauled on the reins, bringing the mare to a sliding stop in front of a large building with a sign that said "Saloon and Boarding House." Men poured out of the buildings, alerted by the gunfire, many of them armed, riders coming. Grace shouted. "Men trying to kill us. We need help." A tall man with a gray beard and a sheriff's star pinned to his vest stepped forward. "Who are you and why should we help you?" "My name is Grace Nolan. I am with Daniel Greene. He said the people here owe him a debt." Recognition and respect flashed across the man's face. "Daniel Greene. Where is he?" Grace turned to point back up the trail and her heart stopped. Daniel was riding hard down the slope, but the three gunmen were right behind him, firing as they rode. She watched in horror as one of the bullets found its mark, saw Daniel jerk in the saddle, saw the red bloom of blood on his shoulder. "No!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and anguished. The miners were already moving, rifles coming up, and a volley of shots rang out. The three gunmen pulled up short, realizing they had ridden into a hornet's nest. Ryan tried to turn his horse, but a bullet took him in the chest and he toppled from the saddle. Barnes managed to get his horse turned and started back up the slope, but another volley brought him down as well. Snake, seeing his companions fall, spurred his horse hard and disappeared over the ridge. Daniel made it into the camp and slid from his saddle, his face pale with pain and blood loss. Grace was off her horse and running to him before he hit the ground, catching him, trying to hold him up. "I am all right," he said through gritted teeth. "It is just a flesh wound." "You are not all right. You have been shot." Grace looked around wildly. "Does anyone here know medicine? He needs a doctor." "I have some training," a woman said, stepping forward. She was middle-aged with capable hands and a no-nonsense expression. "Get him inside. I will see what I can do." They carried Daniel into the boarding house and laid him on a bed. The woman, who introduced herself as Molly Henderson, cut away his shirt and examined the wound. Grace held Daniel's hand, her heart in her throat, watching the blood seep from the bullet hole in his shoulder. "You are lucky," Molly said finally. "The bullet went clean through, missed the bone and any major blood vessels. But you have lost a fair amount of blood, and the wound needs to be cleaned and stitched. This is going to hurt." "Do what you need to do," Daniel said, and his eyes found Grace's. "I have survived worse." Grace stayed with him through the whole ordeal, holding his hand while Molly cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Daniel go white around the lips. She held him while Molly stitched the ragged flesh, feeling him tremble with pain but never crying out. And when it was finally done, and Molly had bandaged the shoulder and given him laudanum for the pain, Grace sat beside the bed and refused to leave. The gray, bearded man with the sheriff's star came to check on them. His name was Thomas Bright, and he had been elected unofficial law in the mining camp. He listened to Grace's story, examined the documents she showed him, and shook his head in disgust. "Edmund Sharp is a snake, but I never knew he was this crooked. These documents are dynamite, miss. They could bring down half the territorial government." He looked at Daniel, who was drifting in and out of consciousness from the laudanum. "Daniel Greene is one of the best men I know. He came through for us when we needed help, and we will do the same for him now. You two will be safe here until he is well enough to travel, and then I will personally escort you to Sheridan." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." Over the next week, Daniel healed slowly but surely. The wound was clean and showed no signs of infection, and his strength returned day by day. Grace barely left his side, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, helping Molly change his bandages, feeding him broth and then more substantial meals as his appetite returned. They talked for hours, making plans for the future with a certainty that had only grown stronger in the face of danger. Daniel told her about the house he wanted to build on his ranch, about the room that would be their bedroom with windows facing east to catch the sunrise. Grace told him about the garden she would plant, about the chickens and pigs she would raise, about the children they would teach to ride and raid and love the land as they did. "Marry me," Daniel said one afternoon, when he was well enough to sit up in bed. "I know I should wait until this is all over, until I can do it properly with a ring and flowers and all the things you deserve. But I do not want to wait, Grace. I want to know that you are mine and I am yours, today and always." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Thomas Bright found a circuit preacher passing through the camp, and they were married that evening in the saloon with the miners as witnesses. Grace wore a borrowed dress that was too big for her, and Daniel stood with his arm in a sling, but neither of them cared. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Daniel kissed her, sealing their vows, Grace felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. They spent their wedding night in that small room in the boarding house, and if it was not the grand romantic evening that most brides dreamed of, it did not matter. Daniel made love to her with a gentleness that took her breath away, mindful of his injured shoulder but determined to make their first time together special. Afterwards, they lay tangled together under the quilts, and Grace felt a contentment she had not known was possible. "I love you, Mrs. Greene," Daniel murmured against her hair. "I love you too, Mr. Greene," Grace said, and thought that those were the most beautiful words she had ever spoken. 10 days after the gunfight, Daniel was well enough to travel, and true to his word, Thomas Bright organized an escort of 20 armed miners to accompany them to Sheridan. They rode out on a clear, cold morning, and this time there was no sign of Sharp's men. Word had spread through the mountains about what had happened at Silver Creek Camp, and it seemed that even Edmund Sharp's hired guns knew better than to tangle with a company of angry miners. They reached Sheridan 3 days later and went directly to the territorial marshal's office. Marshal John Wade was a stern-faced man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Grace's story, examined the documents she had brought, and his expression grew grimmer with each page he turned. "This is enough to file charges against a dozen men," he said finally. "Edmund Sharp, 3 land office clerks, 2 judges, and a territorial legislator. It is going to cause quite a scandal when this comes out." "Will it stand up in court?" Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. "With testimony from the clerk who was threatened, and with these forged documents as evidence? Yes, I believe it will. I will start making arrests today." Marshal Wade looked at her with something like respect. "You are a brave woman, Mrs. Greene. You risked your life to bring these men to justice. Wyoming needs more people like you." The trials took place over the following months, and they were indeed the scandal that Marshal Wade had predicted. Edmund Sharp and his accomplices were found guilty on multiple counts of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Sharp himself was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, and the others received varying sentences. The deeds that had been fraudulently transferred were declared void, and the land was returned to its rightful owners. Grace and Daniel rode back to what had been the Nolan ranch on a warm day in May of 1884. The house was in disrepair after standing empty for so long, and the fences needed mending, but the land was still there, the good water still flowed from the creek, and the mountains still stood guard over the valley. "Welcome home," Daniel said, helping Grace down from her horse. Grace looked around at the place where she had grown up, feeling her father's presence in every fence post and barn beam. "Welcome home," she echoed, and knew that she meant it. They threw themselves into the work of rebuilding, and it was hard labor, but satisfying. Daniel brought his cattle down from his high country ranch and combined them with the small herd that Grace was able to buy back from local ranchers. They hired a few hands to help with the work, good men who were grateful for honest employment. Slowly but surely, The Nolan Ranch, which they renamed the Double G Ranch in honor of their shared initials, came back to life. Thomas Bright and some of the miners from Silver Creek came down to help them raise a new barn, and Molly Henderson visited often, becoming a dear friend to Grace. The territorial governor, embarrassed by the scandal and eager to make amends, granted Grace a formal apology and a certificate of appreciation for her courage in exposing the corruption. But the best reward came in February of 1885, when Grace went into labor on a snowy evening much like the one when she and Daniel had first met. Daniel rode through the storm to fetch Molly, who had moved to Buffalo to be closer to them, and together they helped Grace bring her first child into the world. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Patrick Daniel Greene, after the two men who had shaped their lives. Daniel held his son with a wonder that made Grace's heart swell. "He is perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers, marveling at the miniature perfection of him. "He is ours," Grace said, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. "Our son." Over the years that followed, the Double G Ranch prospered. They added more land, built a bigger house with those east-facing windows that Daniel had promised, and had 3 more children, 2 girls and another boy. Grace taught them all to read and write and think for themselves, while Daniel taught them to ride and rope and work the land. They grew up strong and confident, knowing they were loved, knowing they came from good stock on both sides. Grace sometimes thought about that terrible winter when she had nearly died in the snow, when everything had seemed hopeless and dark. She thought about the moment Daniel had appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. Sometimes on snowy evenings, when the children were in bed and she and Daniel sat by the fire, she would tell the story of how they met, of how snow had fallen as she tried to walk away from her old life, and how a cowboy had said the words that changed everything. "What did I say?" Daniel would always ask, playing his part in their familiar ritual, and Grace would smile and lean into his embrace and whisper the words she would never forget. "You said, 'Please do not leave me.' And you stayed," Daniel would say, kissing her forehead. "I stayed," Grace would agree. "And I have never regretted it for a single moment." They grew old together on that ranch, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. They saw Wyoming change from a rough frontier territory to a more settled state, saw the railroad come through and bring new opportunities. But through all the changes, through all the years, the love between them remained constant, a steady flame that warmed them through every season. When Daniel died in his sleep at the age of 78, Grace held his hand and whispered that she loved him, that she would see him again, that he had been the best part of her life. She followed him 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without him in it, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, and afterwards, they sat in the house that Daniel had built and told stories about the two people who had loved each other so completely. They talked about Grace's courage and Daniel's honor, about the legacy of integrity and hard work they had left behind. But most of all, they talked about the love story that had started on a snowy mountain in the winter of 1883, when a woman running for her life had met a man who would give his life to protect her. The Double G Ranch stayed in the family for generations, and somewhere in the house, carefully preserved, was a leather satchel containing old documents that had once been worth killing for. New generations would find it and ask about it, and the story would be told again, the story of how justice had been won and love had been found in the wild heart of Wyoming. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler than that. It was the story of two people who had found each other when they needed each other most, who had built a life together based on trust and respect and deep, abiding love. It was the story of a cowboy who said, "Please do not leave me," and a woman who stayed, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because she had found in him everything she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. Years after their deaths, their great-granddaughter, a writer living in New York City, came back to Wyoming to visit the old ranch. She walked up the hill to where Grace and Daniel were buried, reading the simple headstones that marked their graves. Grace Nolan Greene, beloved wife and mother. Daniel Patrick Greene, beloved husband and father. The dates of their births and deaths, the span of years that had held a lifetime of love. The great-granddaughter sat on the grass between the graves and opened a journal that had belonged to Grace, found in a trunk in the attic. She read Grace's words, written in faded ink, telling the story of that winter long ago. She read about fear and courage, about justice and corruption, about a snowstorm and a cowboy and a love that had changed everything. When she was finished reading, she closed the journal and looked out over the valley, at the ranch that still bore the Double G brand, at the mountains that stood eternal and unchanging. She thought about the grandmother she had never met, about the courage it must have taken to fight for what was right, about the leap of faith it must have taken to trust a stranger in a storm. And she thought about love, about the kind of love that lasts through decades and hardships, through losses and triumphs, through all the small moments that make up a life. The kind of love that people spend their whole lives searching for and sometimes never find. The kind of love that Grace and Daniel had found in each other on a snowy mountain so long ago. She stood and brushed the grass from her jeans, placing a hand on each headstone in turn. "Thank you," she whispered to her ancestors, to these two people who had loved so well. "Thank you for showing us what it means to be brave, to be true, to build something that lasts." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and sage, and for just a moment, the great-granddaughter could have sworn she heard laughter on the breeze, joyful and young and full of love. She smiled and walked back down the hill, back to the house where generations of Greenes had been born and raised, where the legacy of Grace and Daniel lived on in every board and beam. The story had begun with a woman running through snow, desperate and afraid, and a man who appeared when she needed him most. It had continued through trials and danger, through a love that grew stronger with every challenge it faced. And it had ended, as all good stories do, with a life well lived and a love well earned, with children and grandchildren who carried on the legacy of two remarkable people. But perhaps it was not really an ending at all. Perhaps it was just another beginning, another chapter in the ongoing story of the Double G Ranch and the family that had built it. The story of Grace and Daniel would be told and retold for generations, passed down like a precious heirloom, a reminder of what love could accomplish, of what courage could achieve. And somewhere, if such things were possible, Grace and Daniel were together again, young and strong and full of joy, riding across endless golden fields under a sky so blue it hurt to look at it. There was no pain there, no fear, no sorrow. Just the two of them and the love they had found and the eternity they had earned. The snow had fallen as she tried to walk away, and the cowboy had said, "Please do not leave me." She had stayed, and in staying, had found everything she had ever wanted, everything she had ever needed. It was a simple story in many ways, the oldest story there is, the one about two people who found each other against all odds and built a love that lasted forever. And it was true, every word of it, as true as the mountains and the sky and the land that had witnessed it all. In the wild west of Wyoming, in the hard years of the 1880s, Grace Nolan and Daniel Greene had lived and loved and left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. That was their story. That was their gift to the future. And it was enough.